Hi, John Wilkinson here, and History Made Easier. If you're studying the American depth study, America in the 1920s and into the Great Depression, I think it's really important that you have a good understanding of the American political system. The first of my ebooks on the American depth study gives a good overview of this, or at least I like to think it's good. And this video is going to attempt to do a similar job. I think there are two overarching principles to the American political system that is reflected in the American Constitution. The first is that there must be a balance of power across the political system, across the three branches of the state: the executive, which is essentially the government, the legislature, the law-making bodies, and the law courts. And in the American system, there's also a balance of power between the federal government in Washington and the state governments. The second principle, I think, is that the individual is supreme. The individual, his and her rights and his and her responsibilities are paramount or of paramount importance in the American political system and in its constitution. We'll look at that a little bit more towards the end of this video. So we have these three branches of the state. We have the executive, we have the legislature, and we have the law courts. In the American system, the president heads the executive. The president is one at the same time the head of government and the head of state, so that the president appoints his or her ministers. They have to be ratified by the legislature, in this case by the Senate, but the appointment comes from the president. And the president is also head of state. So, for example, the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And so we have the executive. The legislature in the American system consists of two houses: the House of Representatives, which is the lower house, and the upper chamber, the upper house, the Senate. The House of Representatives is populated by congressmen, and the Senate is populated by senators. And then there is the legal system, and in the American Constitution, the highest court in the land is the Supreme Court, a court of 9 justices, appointed by the president again, and overseen or ratified again by the Senate. They are appointed for life or until they retire, and so at times their appointments can be very controversial. They ultimately have a say in whether legislation, either coming directly from the president in the form of executive orders or coming from the legislature in the case of laws, they ultimately decide whether this legislation is constitutional or not. So they are very powerful within the political system. So we have our three branches of government. The president is elected directly through a complicated electoral college system. This works by giving the states with the biggest populations more votes. The people in each state will vote for whichever candidate they so wish to vote for. And the winning candidate in each state, whether they win by one vote or by thousands of votes, the winner in each state gets all the electoral college votes from that state. So, for example, California, which is the most populated state in America, has 54 college votes. Wyoming, the least populated state, has just 3 college votes. So winning California in the presidential race is more important than winning Wyoming. And their votes will be added up until they get a majority. So that's how the American president is elected for 4 years. The House of Representatives, again, are elected from the states, but based on population. So again, California would have more congressmen in the House of Representatives than Wyoming will. They are elected, I think the magic number is roughly every 450,000 population gets a congressman. So again, more populated areas will have more congressmen. They are elected for 2 yearly terms. So they have to face elections every 2 years. The Senate, on the other hand, every state elects 2 senators, no matter how big or small those states are. So there are 50 states, there are 100 senators. They are elected for 6 years, but there's a complication in that too, because a third of them are elected every 2 years. So there are elections for senators, for a different group of senators every 2 years. And in that way, again, you see a balance of power, because the president's party might sweep the elections in 1 year, but 2 years later, the political map, the political picture might have changed, and the House of Representatives changes character, and the president can find himself or herself with a minority in the House of Representatives. Similarly, in the Senate too, a third of them are elected every 2 years. So the complexion of American politics can be forever changing. It's not just that 4 yearly election of the president that matters in America. Elections every 2 years can make the complexion of American politics change quite radically. So we have a balance of power there, even in the electoral systems. There is a balance of power between the federal government and the state governments. The federal government, the President of America heading it, is responsible for things like foreign policy, defense, trade, financial matters like federal taxes, interest rates, though ultimately interest rates are controlled by the federal bank. Whereas each state has its own elected legislature, and they are responsible for things like education, for policing, and for their own judicial systems. So there's a real balance of power there too. It's a very complicated system. The idea that the American president is all-powerful couldn't be further from the truth. And even though they might have been, operating in the political system all their lives, I think it still comes as a shock to many American presidents when they gain power and they realise, well, I can't do everything I want. It's a very tricky, complex system. So we have that balance of power there across, if you like, the national system and between the national system and the states. Now, I said I would come back to the individual being king in America. I think the American system has two other elements to this. We have a system in which really Americans lean towards limited government. They don't like government being too evasive in their lives. They don't like everybody, I suppose, but they don't like the government taxing them too much. But they don't like government legislating on their behalf too much. And this is linked to the individual being seen as so fundamentally important in the American system. Individual rights are very, very important. We see both these things, the reluctance to see their government intruding in their lives and the importance of the individual. We see it most controversially in the right to bear arms in America, that no matter what atrocities occur, Americans are determined to hang on to this right to own a gun. That is not the government's business. So I think I've given a decent overview there. You will see this coming out in your studies of American history in the 20s, in the 30s, the reluctance to interfere in, for example, the stock exchange, the reluctance to get involved, at least from the Republican Party, to get involved in the recovery from the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and the controversies around Roosevelt's legislation when he is elected as a Democrat and seeks to interfere in the American way, as it were. So you will see this coming out, and I think a good understanding of the political system will help you see where these arguments are coming from. So I think this video will prove useful for you. I certainly hope so. But as always, I thank you for listening. And as always, I give you a little reminder to check out my History Made Easier website. But for now, cheers.